There was a young man at Nunhead who awoke in a coffin of lead. "It is cozy enough," he remarked in a huff, "but I wasn't aware I was dead." This limerick was published anonymously in the early 1900s and is a pretty light start to what is going to be a pretty dark topic, although that's par for the course on this channel. Today's subject is something that I've always feared, so I wanted to talk about it and the way other people have viewed it throughout history. Let's talk about the fear of being buried alive by mistake. So to start out, the concept of premature burial is a pretty broad one, so I want to narrow it down a bit and talk about what this video will be and won't be. I'll mostly be talking about the history of the fear of premature burial and how people have viewed it, as well as some stories of people who were accidentally buried alive. Some of them are true, some of them are more dubious. I'll also give a bit of advice on how to prevent or even survive it. I'm not going to talk about premature burial as a form of capital punishment. It's used by soldiers in war crimes, or it's used by criminals such as drug lords. I already talked a little bit about premature burial on my video on torture methods that I did a while back. The production quality isn't very good, but I think the script still holds up pretty well, so I'll put a link to it up in the cards and down below if you want to check it out. So why are people so afraid of being buried alive? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. It's dangerous, and your chances of survival are pretty low, especially if you're buried in a coffin 6 feet underground, as most people in the Western world today are. Estimates range from as high as 5 hours to as low as 1 hour before you suffocate. And if you're claustrophobic like me, this becomes even worse to imagine. In fact, the fear of premature burial even has its own word, taphophobia. And the reality of potential premature burial has existed as long as humans have. In biblical times, people's bodies were wrapped in shrouds and put in caves after they died, so someone could check on them a few days later and make sure they were really dead. For example, see the story of Lazarus. But the fear didn't really start taking off until much more recently. The earliest recorded instance I could find of it was in the 1600s. Princess Elizabeth of Orleans requested her body not be shrouded for 24 hours after she died, and that her feet be cut with a razor. By the way, I think this is the third video in a row where I've had a bunch of French words to pronounce. I'm not doing that on purpose, but I do hope I'm not butchering the French pronunciations in this video as much as I fear I am, and there are a lot more French words to come. The 1700s and 1800s brought even more odd requests. The famous Danish author Hans Christian Andersen carried a card in his pocket that said, "I am not really dead," when he traveled out of his native Denmark, so foreign doctors wouldn't accidentally declare him dead. If it's not obvious by now, Andersen didn't trust foreign doctors very much. He also asked a friend to ensure his arteries were cut after he died. He already had liver cancer at this point and died 2 days after this request was made, but I'm not sure if his wish was actually granted. Composer Frédéric Chopin requested that his heart be cut out to ensure he was dead. Not only was this request granted, but his heart was kept preserved and studied over 150 years later. In an age where fear of disease caused people to bury bodies less than a day after the person's death, George Washington requested that he not be buried until he'd been dead for 2 days. Washington died on December 14, 1799, and was buried 3 days later, so it looks like he got his wish as well. And these fears weren't totally without merit. Stories of people being accidentally presumed dead and then waking up before their burial date back to ancient times. Death was determined when your heart stopped, and the people who were supposed to declare a person dead were usually family members, not doctors. In the 1500s and even later, a lot of plague victims were accidentally buried alive. Not only was it hard to tell if they were dead, but if they woke up, it was hard for them to get up because they were buried in mass graves on top of piles of other bodies. One story from this era tells of a piper who passed out drunk and was presumed dead. When he woke up, he managed to escape by playing his flute to alert others to his presence. You know, I used to play the clarinet when I was younger. Maybe I should brush up on my clarinet skills and carry it with me wherever I go, or at least request that I be buried with it. One account says the body of philosopher John Duns Scotus, who died in 1308, was later found outside his coffin. Allegedly. Another story involves Christian theologian Thomas à Kempis, who died in 1471. His body was exhumed a few hundred years later when the Catholic Church was considering canonizing him. But when they found fingernail scratch marks on the lid of his coffin, they decided not to make him a saint. Apparently, this meant that he feared death, and a saint shouldn't fear death because they're going to meet God in heaven. This is another story that is either exaggerated or just not true. Another, possibly more legitimate account is that of Matthew Wall, who died in the 1500s. At Matthew's funeral, some of his pallbearers slipped on wet leaves and dropped his coffin. This apparently woke Matthew up because he knocked on the lid of the coffin and was let out. He ended up living another 24 years. A popular legend in the town of Basingstoke in England tells of the story of Alice Blunden. Back in 1674, Alice drank poppy water and passed out, appearing dead. She was later pronounced dead by a doctor who used the so-called mirror method, where you hold up a mirror to a person's nose or mouth and see if it fogs up from their breath. More on this method later. 2 days after Alice was buried, kids playing near the cemetery thought they heard a voice. They told their school headmaster, who didn't believe them at first. But the next day, he went to the grave and heard the voice for himself, so Alice's body was exhumed. She was found alive, but battered and close to death. She was left in the grave and a guard was sent to watch over it. But it rained that night, so the guard peaced out and went to the bar. When the coffin was opened the next day, Alice was found dead. You had one job, guard. The guard didn't seem to face any consequences, but the doctor who declared her dead was put on trial. He was acquitted because the mirror method he used was considered legitimate at the time. Another story from France is more of a folk tale and doesn't actually involve burial, but it's too crazy to pass up sharing. A young man is forced into becoming a monk by his parents. One night, he's staying at an inn, and the innkeeper asks him to watch over the body of his recently dead daughter. Once he's alone, the monk takes liberties with the corpse. I will let you use your imagination. Or not. Anyway, turns out the woman's corpse wasn't really a corpse. When the monk returns to the inn 9 months later, he's surprised to learn that not only is the woman not dead, but she has a new baby. Once he puts two and two together, he confesses everything to the woman and her parents and agrees to marry her. Surprisingly, everyone else agrees to this as well, and I guess they live happily ever after. In 1740, Danish anatomist Jacques Benet Winslow wrote a treatise that suggested ways to tell if a person was really dead. His suggestions included putting onions, garlic, and horseradish up the person's nose, rubbing garlic on their lips, and stimulating their skin with whips and nettles. If nothing happened, he proceeded to slice the corpse's feet, put needles under their toenails, burn their feet, or pour boiling wax on their forehead. Winslow was pretty paranoid about people being erroneously declared dead. As he once put it, "It is evidence from experience that many apparently dead have afterwards proved themselves alive by rising from their shrouds, their coffins, and even from their graves." A few years later, a French doctor named Jean-Jacques Bruhier came across Winslow's treatise and started working on some writings of his own. He eventually published the Dissertation sur l'incertitude des signes de la mort. I told you there was going to be a lot of French in this video. This roughly translates to Dissertation on the Uncertainty of the Signs of Death. Brugier's work told more stories of people who were buried alive, though a lot of these were exaggerated or just not true. But the book was pretty popular and went through several editions. It might have even changed perspectives on premature burial and death in Europe, especially in Germany, where the German translation did especially well. It was around this time in Europe that people started waiting 12 to 24 hours before burying bodies. Brugier also suggested state-run morgues staffed by doctors and watchmen. Brugier's findings were questioned by some doctors, but there seemed to be a lot of general interest in his work. In the late 1700s, Austrian doctor Johann Peter Frank had his own close brush with death. After this, he proposed the idea of houses for the dead in every city where bodies could be taken so they could officially be declared dead. Many of these so-called waiting mortuaries were built around Europe. Most of them were in Germany and acted as sort of bizarre mini museums. If you wanted to go inside and see the corpses on display, all you had to do was pay a fee. However, as far as preventing premature burial, they didn't do much. There are no documented cases of any corpses in the German facilities ever being revived, and in similar places in cities like Prague and Vienna, the chances of a corpse being revived after being brought to these facilities was less than 1%. Still, the stories of premature burial continued. In mid-1800s Sweden, a story was collected by a medical practitioner about a young pregnant woman who died and was buried in a churchyard. Just hours after she was buried, one of the caretakers started hearing groans from her grave. Thinking it was a ghost, he ran home and hid in his bed. Again, you had one job, caretaker. The next morning, the caretaker told the church rector, who's basically the leader, about what had happened. After the rector berated him for leaving, understandably so, he ordered the coffin exhumed. When church officials opened the coffin and saw the woman's body, they realized she'd given birth in the coffin. It's not confirmed by the story, but I assume both mother and baby actually died. There is a phenomenon called coffin birth, when a pregnant woman dies and gases in her body cause her unborn child to be expelled from her womb. It's pretty rare, and as far as I could find, only happens when the woman is actually dead. By the 1800s, a lot of doctors were skeptical about how common premature burial really was, but the fear was widespread among the public. In 1798, a German man named P.G. Pessler suggested people should be buried with tubes in their coffins. The tubes should be attached to a rope that leads to the church bell, so people can ring the bell if they wake up in their coffin. This idea was modified by several of his peers and eventually snowballed into what were known as safety coffins. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of models of safety coffins. Most of them had some sort of device in them for communicating with the outside world. Some had ropes attached to a bell on the surface. Others had a flag or a firecracker instead. Some even had food and water supplies, fans and alarms, or breathing tubes. And these safety coffins aren't just things of the past. One was patented as recently as 2015 and includes a solar-powered music player. Frankly, I'm not sure how this would help someone who had been buried alive, but maybe listening to music in what would likely be their final hours would at least provide them some comfort. That is, assuming you could get sunlight underground. To be fair, I'm not sure this particular design was meant to save someone from premature burial, but as you might be able to tell, most of these designs weren't very practical. Very few had a permanent air supply, and some of them would set off a bell at the slightest movement of the corpse, even though corpses tend to move around anyway due to decomposition. And despite all the models that were patented, there's no evidence anyone was buried in a safety coffin. By the way, the phrase "saved by the bell" is thought to come from these safety coffins, but that's probably not the case. It's more likely that it came from boxing slang. A boxer who was about to lose a round was saved from defeat by a bell marking the end of the round. As you can imagine, plenty of authors capitalized on the fear of premature burial around this time. We writers just love to talk about dark things, don't we? But the one remembered for it the most today is Edgar Allan Poe. Poe featured premature burial in several of his short stories, namely The Black Cat, The Cask of Amontillado, and The Fall of the House of Usher. But the one where it's on display the most prominently is titled, unsurprisingly, The Premature Burial. Published in 1844, the first half or so of the story goes over several anecdotes of people who were accidentally buried alive, though I doubt any of them are true. My personal favorite follows a wealthy French woman named Victorine Lafourcade. Victorine is pursued by a lower-class journalist, but she rejects him to marry a wealthy banker. The banker doesn't treat her very well, and she dies several years later and is buried in an ordinary underground grave. After her death, her old lover is pretty distraught at losing her, so he goes to her grave one night to dig her up and cut off her hair to keep. Yeah, that's actually a thing that happens in the story. But after digging her up and opening her coffin, he's trying to detach her hair when her eyes open and he realizes she was buried alive. The man takes his old lover back to his house and nurses her back to health. When she's fully recovered, she decides to stay with this man who dug her up and cut off her hair, and they move to America. 20 years later, they return to France, and Victorine's old husband finds out about all this. He tries to make claim to her, but a tribunal declares he has no legal authority over her because of how much time has passed. So I guess everything worked out for her in the end. After some more research, I discovered this story is a retelling of an old folk tale commonly known as the Young Lover's Legend. But on to the main story. The premature burial's narrator suffers from a condition called catalepsy. This condition causes people to go into trances and lose consciousness, their bodies often appearing stiff and rigid, like they're dead. This obviously greatly increases the chances of them being buried alive. The narrator is so afraid of premature burial, he doesn't want to go to sleep because he thinks he might wake up in a coffin. He even has the family vault remodeled to include things like easy opening from the inside, food and water right by the coffin, and a bell from the roof to his hand. He also makes sure his coffin lid will be easy to open. Unfortunately, our narrator wakes up one day and thinks he's been buried alive, with none of these things. He figures he was presumed dead while he was away from home, and of course is in a panic. As it turns out, he wasn't buried alive. It was all a hallucination brought on by a series of strange coincidences. But after this experience, he is able to overcome his fear of premature burial as well as his catalepsy. If you want to read the story for yourself, I'll leave a link to a text version and an audio reading of it down below. Another popular legend that involves premature burial is known as the Lady with the Ring. The story dates as far back as the 1300s, but the most popular version of it seems to be that of Marjorie MacCall. Marjorie MacCall died of fever in 1705 in her native Ireland. She was buried quickly, probably due to the likely unfounded notion that corpses can cause disease. At Marjorie's wake, her loved ones noticed a ring on her finger that they knew would make her a target for grave robbers. They tried to get the ring off her finger, but due to bloating, it wouldn't budge. So Marjorie and her expensive ring were buried at Shankhill Graveyard in Lurgan in Northern Ireland. But the next day, her loved ones' fears came true, and grave robbers dug her up. They tried to get the ring off her finger, but must have had the same bloating problem as her loved ones had, because they resorted to cutting off her finger to get to it. As they started cutting, Marjorie woke up and screamed. The robbers either ran or dropped dead on the spot, depending on the version. Marjorie got up out of her coffin and walked home to her husband and children. In an early version of the story, the woman's husband doesn't let her in because he thinks she's a ghost. In the Marjorie McCall version, her husband answers the door, and when he sees her, either drops dead or faints on sight, again, depending on the version. Marjorie went on to remarry and have more children. One source even said she was having an affair before her presumed death and was already pregnant by an unknown lover. When she died, for real, years later, she was buried in her first grave, though some sources say her first husband was actually buried there. There is a grave in Shankill Graveyard for a Marjorie McCall, complete with an engraving that reads, "Lived once and buried twice." However, it's not clear if this story is true. One source says there are no records of a Marjorie McCall being buried in that cemetery. In a 2016 article, historian Jim Conway said the story is true, and there are no records because they were lost due to a famine at the time. There are multiple different versions of this story that have been floating around for hundreds of years, which makes me think it is more of a legend, but you can't really deny the grave and inscription, so who knows. Another earlier version of this legend was recounted in Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented. In the year 1571, the wife of one of the magistrates of Cologne, being interred with a valuable ring on one of her fingers, the gravedigger next night opened the grave in order to take it off. But we may readily suppose that he was in no small consternation when the supposed dead body squeezed his hand and laid fast hold of him in order to get out of her coffin. The thief, however, disengaging himself, made his escape with all expedition, and the lady, disentangling herself in the best manner she could, went home and knocked at her own door, where, after shivering in her shroud, after some delay, she was admitted by the terror-stricken servants and, being warmed and treated in a proper manner, completely recovered. So let's talk about this book. I think it's a book. Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented was written by a member of the Royal Academy of Medical Sciences named William Tebb and a doctor named Colonel Edward Perry Vallum. It was written in 1896, the same year that Tebb co-founded the London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial. It's basically just what it sounds like, reported instances of premature burial and suggestions on how to prevent it. Tebb and Vallum wrote that things like cremation and avoiding a hasty burial were great ways to prevent premature burial. It also mentions the mirror technique I talked about earlier, but says it's not very reliable because a person might stop temporarily breathing when they're not actually dead. It also lists other methods of prevention, such as injecting substances into the skin, shock, artificial respiration, auscultation, which involves listening to the heart or lungs for signs of life, and the blister test, putting boiling water up to the person's skin to see if it blisters. Premature burial and How It May Be Prevented was generally well received by the public, but there were doctors who criticized it, saying it sensationalized premature burial and that Tebb knew nothing about medicine or physiology. But one of his predecessors in particular had some even darker ideas. In 1859, a Dr. von Roser conducted an experiment to see if people could survive being buried alive for days underground, as some accounts had suggested. He buried several live rats and mice underground in a coffin and dug it back up after a few days. I'm not sure how the animals got air down there, but as it turned out, they survived by eating each other. Dr. von Roser tried the same thing with a singular dog who died after just 3 hours. By the 1900s, the fear of premature burial had started to wane. The London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial was active for a few years, but started to decline after the end of World War II in 1918. I couldn't find much else about them other than a short Wikipedia article, so I assume they eventually went the way of the proverbial dodo. Still, accounts of premature burial continued. In 1895, in North Carolina, a man only named as Jenkins supposedly died of a fever. Despite skepticism that he was really dead, he was buried the next day. A week later, the body was exhumed to be reburied in a family plot. When the coffin was opened to make sure the body was in good enough condition to be hauled the 20 miles to the new plot, his hair had been pulled from his head, and there were fingernail scratch marks on the inside of his coffin. The body was also lying face down. Jenkins's body was reburied, but his family remained convinced that he hadn't initially been dead, only unconscious, and had been buried alive. Another story out of Ontario the following year told of a girl named Collins. It's not clear how long Collins was buried before she was exhumed, but she was exhumed just like Jenkins to be reburied in a family plot. Upon examination of her body, her shroud was torn, her knees were drawn to her chin, one arm was under her head, and her features bore evidence of dreadful torture. But one of the more popular stories of premature burial around this time is that of Essie Dunbar. Essie was presumed dead after an epileptic fit in 1915 and set to be buried the next day. The funeral was carried out as usual and Essie's body was buried. A few minutes after the burial, Essie's sister arrived at the gravesite and asked for her sister to be exhumed so she could see her one last time. No version of the story I could find explained why her sister arrived to the funeral so late, but her wish was granted and Essie's body was exhumed. When the lid was open, Essie sat up and smiled at her sister. The three pastors at the funeral all fell back into the grave from shock, thinking Essie was a ghost. Essie was treated with suspicion for the rest of her life, with people also thinking she was a ghost. But the story kept growing and was told and retold for years until her actual death in 1955. Other sources say 1961 or 1962, and the validity of the story in general is doubted. In fact, the picture of Essie you should have seen earlier may or may not be her. But one confirmed case of premature burial happened just a couple of decades later. French teenager Angelo Hayes was just 19 when he died in a motorcycle accident in 1937. Angelo's injuries were so bad, his parents weren't allowed to see his body. His insurance company was suspicious of his accidental death, so 2 days after he was buried, he was exhumed for an examination. But upon inspection, doctors were stunned to find that his body was still warm. As it turned out, Angelo wasn't dead, but likely in a coma that slowed his breathing to the point that doctors couldn't find a pulse. This might also be how he survived underground for so long. Because he was comatose, his body didn't need as much oxygen as most people would. Angelo went on to become a mini celebrity and even invented his own safety coffin before he died in 2008 at the age of 90. In the latter half of the 20th century, stories of premature burial waned even more. Most of the ones I found were of people who were presumed dead but actually woke up before burial, sometimes in a hospital morgue or even at their own funeral. But I did find a couple of cases from the 2000s. One involved a woman in Greece who supposedly died of cancer in 2014. After her funeral, kids playing outside the cemetery thought they heard a voice calling for help from underground. They called the police and the woman was exhumed, but sadly they couldn't get to her in time. She'd woken up just after her funeral and actually died in her coffin of suffocation. Her family was planning a lawsuit, but I couldn't find any more updates on this. In another case out of Brazil, Rosângela Almeida dos Santos was thought to have died of septic shock in 2018. Her relatives said her body was still warm, but she was buried anyway. About a week and a half later, people in the area of the cemetery reported hearing screams from her coffin. Rosângela was exhumed and found to have wounds on her forehead, and the nails in her coffin had been loosened. She also hadn't decomposed very much, and sadly she was dead at this point. This story was disputed by another source, which said she might not have decomposed that fast due to antibiotics she'd been given at the hospital. The same article says Rosângela's brother said the reported wounds to her body weren't real. So I'm not sure of the validity of this story. The last story I have is a bit different. In 2020, a construction worker in Thirumangalam in India entered a 10-foot trench that caved in and buried him alive. His co-workers and emergency services tried to revive him, but he sadly ended up dying. But with all these stories, you might be wondering, just how common is premature burial? Believe it or not, even at the height of so-called taphophobia, being buried alive was extremely rare. As you may have seen throughout this video, a lot of the reports of premature burial were either not true or exaggerated. And it's also difficult to prove someone was actually buried alive. For starters, there's not always a good reason to exhume their body, especially if they were buried underground and not in a family vault. And by the time they are exhumed, they could be too decomposed to tell. Many corpses were presumed to have been buried alive because they were found years later in unusual positions, but those positions can often be chalked up to normal movement due to decomposition or to grave robbers moving the bodies. Doctors would also be reluctant to admit they made a mistake and declared someone dead when they weren't, or to call out their colleagues for doing the same. And premature burial is even more rare today. Modern methods of telling if a person has truly died include things like EEGs, which show brain activity, and administering atropine, which checks for heart activity. Sometimes a light will be shined in the person's eyes to see if their pupils react. In order to confirm death, multiple tests have to be administered and multiple doctors have to confirm the death. And even if you somehow made your way to the morgue still alive, most people today are embalmed, which makes premature burial pretty much impossible. Also, funeral directors today can absolutely tell the difference between a living person and a dead one. By the way, corpses don't bleed, so if you were, say, cut open for an autopsy or nicked during the pre-embalming shave and blood came out, that would be a dead giveaway. No pun intended. But let's say it still happened. Somehow, against all odds, you were presumed dead when you weren't, requested not to be embalmed, and woke up in a box 6 feet under. How would you get out? I found a couple different sources that gave pretty similar tips on how to escape being buried alive. First off, don't panic. You don't have much oxygen and you want to conserve what little you do have. Take deep breaths and hold them as long as you can. If you're in a metal coffin, there's not much you can do from here other than scream with your lips against the coffin wall to alert passersby. If you can find anything hard in your pockets, you can use that to tap the SOS signal against the coffin lid. 3 quick taps, 3 slow taps, and 3 more quick taps. If you're in a wooden coffin, your chances are slightly higher. Find the place where the coffin's boards combine because that's going to be the most likely place to break it. Take your shirt off to the point that it's over your neck. Break through the coffin and let the dirt flow underneath you as you continue to widen the hole. Once you've made a big enough opening, start moving up, using your shirt over your head as an air bubble. Once you've wriggled up enough, you can break through to the surface, especially if you were recently buried, since the dirt will still be loose. I really have no idea how reliable this advice is, or what the odds are of you actually completing all these steps successfully. But if nothing else, hopefully it'll give you some comfort if you're still afraid of this happening. Before I go, I want to mention the book Buried Alive, The Terrifying History of Our Most Primal Fear by Dr. Jan Bondeson. I got some of my information in the video from this book, and tons of other sources I used mentioned it as well. As far as I could tell, it's one of the most extensive books on taphophobia and premature burial out there. And of course, I will leave a link to it below if you want to check it out for yourself. So that's all I have for you today on accidental premature burial and the fear of it. As terrifying as this concept still is to me, I was relieved to learn that it was still pretty rare even in the 1800s when science and medicine weren't as advanced as they are today. Still, I would like to be buried with my cell phone, just in case. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and share it. And for more dark content, I hope you'll consider subscribing and hitting that bell. Thanks for watching and have a creepy day. Bye guys.